start like this, don't we?
Yeah. So welcome you all to the seminar series, book discussion by Dr. Nilamber Chhetri, who is currently with the School of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Mandi. So his book is titled "The Politics of Ethnic Renewal in Darjeeling, Gorkhas and the Struggle for Tribal Recognition," which was this last year, I guess.
Yeah.
February 2022. So over to him, and then once he's finished, we can have the usual questions and answers.
Fine.
Yeah, over to you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the School of Humanities and Social Science for this opportunity. And as you can see, this is the title of the book which was published last year. It's published from Routledge. On one side, you can see the this international edition, and on the other side, after 8 months, this was the South Asia edition, which actually came out. So, what I'm planning to do for this presentation is to talk about the content of the book, but in such a way that not only the chapterized summary of what is there in the content, but at least to provoke and the scholars of humanities and social science to think anew certain forms in which we can at least engage with this idea of a tribe and tribal politics and so on and so forth. So to start off, many people actually confuses me, and when they look at the title, they think that this is all about tribal politics in India, or I myself work only on the issues of tribes. But as such, this book actually details more on the issues of classification, right? So the issues of what entails in this whole process of the modalities of classification, and the ways in which the state engages itself in this process of classification, and all those categories through which the state actually deals with different kinds of groupings are internalized by the groups themselves. Sometimes it also gets manifested in many kinds of demands which they make before the state. So I'm only looking at this particular aspect of the classification process, the politics of classification, and the ways in which the categories themselves have a social life of their own. Sometimes you also engage in different other forms of political maneuvering in order to get classified within the strict regime of the classificatory process of the Indian state. So this is more of an empirical study which actually tries to deal with, it's an ethnographic study, but which have also involved other kinds of methods which I will be speaking about, so that some research scholars who are here with us can also deal with similar kind of issues when they are confronted with it, how to go about dealing with those kind of concerns. So it's more of an empirical study of group demanding recognition as tribes in Eastern Himalaya. The area of my major interest is the region of Darjeeling and Kalimpong. So the book actually discusses about the ethnographic material which is collected from the regions of Darjeeling and Kalimpong as two major districts. So it's more empirical in nature, but it also has other kinds of data within the text embedded in different chapters of the text. Second is it looks at the historical development of demands while problematizing the classification practices followed in India since the colonial period. So it not only looks at one minuscule notion about how certain groups of people are demanding recognition, which does not deal only with that, but it delves into the larger process and politics of classification which is there in the Indian context. And towards the end of the presentation, I would also submit before you some provocative thoughts through which we can rethink the whole issues of classification and the idea of category in Indian context. So third important aspect it tries to look at is how ethnic group recast their identities while tracing the genealogy through performances in the ritual context to attain recognition as scheduled tribe. So it also looks at the performative claims which groups make in order to be classed as a scheduled tribe in Indian context. So I will try to go about the details about, if not the entire historical detail, but outline in brief how the book actually tries to deal with certain issues of social change and also the historical changes alongside the political changes, and which leads to the recasting of identities in the Eastern Himalayas. Last is, as I submitted before you, last is the book tries to contextualize the issues of justice that is deeply embedded within recognition politics, and that is more of the book. It does not try to come up with a clear-cut answer to all the issues that we are confronted with this idea of classification. Rather, it tries to come up with certain kind of a discourse through which we can rethink the entire classificatory and categorization process in South Asia in a nutshell. So the different places where this, the field, the data for which the book actually details is through field sites and different kinds of places that I have conducted the, so Darjeeling district, as you can see on the map, and this was one of the sites where the fieldwork was conducted. And during the course of my fieldwork, I engaged with 10 different ethnic groups. Now it's very interesting for us also to note down that this 10, I'm calling them as ethnic group because they recast their identities as ethnic groups in today's time, right? But if you look at it more closely, they can be considered as caste groups, in fact. So they are also classed as either OBC or different other kinds of categories by the Indian state. So there are almost 10, they are not almost, there are exactly 10 in number. Khas, Mangar, Gurung, Kirat, Kamburai, Jogi, Bujel, Newar, Thami, Sunwar and Yaka. So the book actually tries to details the nature in which they form at a certain point in time, juncture. They form different forms of ethnic associations of their own, especially it happens from the period of 1990s, but there are also other kinds of historical genealogy which tries to portray the fact that some of these groups already had their own ethnic associations back in the colonial time. But we can also look at how this whole idea of ethnic formation which took place during, after in the post-1990 period also led to restructuring of different forms of identity concerns in the region of Darjeeling. So the methods part, as I was telling you, it's more of a mixed method. I would not only call it as an ethnography. The ethnography would be one of the most important ways in which I engage with the ethnic leaders, different organizations, different groups, political leaders and so on and so forth. But it also utilizes other kinds of techniques such as in-depth interviews. Then you have of various kinds of leaders, as you can see, office bearers. Importantly, you also have to engage with the state anthropologists, and sometimes you come up with very interesting kind of insights when you are engaging with the state anthropologist. Because the conception of tribe that we have in Indian context in today's time, it's what I feel, and I am trying to problematize this whole idea, is that it has become more of a crystallized, something which is structured already, and it already presupposes certain kind of subjectivity of the people. At the same time, it also outlines certain ways in which we should approach the whole idea of tribe. But this idea of tribe itself is ambivalent in some regards. So the process of engaging with the state anthropologists is to understand how the state anthropologists view this whole idea of tribe within their practices, and how groups who are engaging with those state anthropologists in their interaction, a certain kind of conception of tribe actually emerges. And that's why I'm saying this book is not about tribes as such, but it's a book about tribes in making. What happens when a certain kind of ethnic groups demand recognition as a tribe? What are the processes which entails, which goes in the fabricating or structuring of the identity? And they are also not just fabricating in the social milieu, but also at the political milieu and also at the bureaucratic kind of milieu. So the book actually tries to open up that kind of a space, that kind of a discourse, through which we can review those kind of identities which have been crystallized as something monolith, something which is unchanging. But we also find that there is certain kind of fluidity in the way in which people articulate their own ideas and their identities as scheduled tribe. So other thing which is of interest, as you can see, is that apart from the ethnographic kind of document, the research also develops upon archival data. So for that, I have collected a lot of information from the National Archives. Also from ethnic associations, there are different kinds of memorandums, different kinds of documents which become very, very important for us to understand the nature in which the demands of that particular group evolved over a period of time. So you have very interesting kind of documents. Sometimes you find documents which, something like letters, which the ethnic associations have written to different officials. And that shows you the way in which they are structuring their identity claims before the state officials as well as with different agencies with whom they are working with. So you have ethnic literature, memorandum, correspondence with the state agencies, and so on and so forth. Now this was, I deliberately kept it here because what it entailed was that I myself, I am an insider to the place. I also come from the region of Kalimpong. Earlier Kalimpong was part of the Darjeeling district. Now after 2017 onwards, it has been carved out as a distinct district altogether. So looking at the groups and the nature of ethnic processes unfolding in case of Darjeeling also becomes very challenging at times as an insider, because that's why I'm titling it as Living Strangely with Intimates, Reconciling Multiplex Subjectivity. For method, it's for some scholars who are engaging on fieldwork and other kinds of things in their own society, it becomes a challenge. So I kept it here so that we can later on have a discussion on the same. That means that you also have to assume a role of an outsider sometimes. You also have to assume unfamiliarity with the terrain and the groups that you are working with when you are engaging with your own folks at least. So some of the ways in which they were recasting their identities seemed very alien to me. In fact, which I never myself have heard as part of that particular society and part of that group. So it tries to look at those kind of ambivalent spaces through which this articulation of identity takes place. There would be certain cultural items or idioms which would be taken up by the ethnic leaders to recast their identity as a tribe. So this is a very, very fascinating kind of an area in which we take into consideration not only things which are as it is, but also how it evolves over a period of time. So that becomes very, very interesting. And therefore, I also understood this fact that living strangely with intimates also entailed managing different forms of subjectivities of your own. As an insider, as a male, as a group, as a person of a group of a certain kind of class background, you also have to negotiate with different kinds of subjectivities in the field. So that's also one part of. So the question that the book actually tries to address, and in many parlance, when we are discussing the whole idea of tribes, this idea becomes somewhat, it loses its main thrust. What or who is a scheduled tribe? Now, this question itself is very big and very large, and this book actually tries to note down, as I told you, that it does not only mean that whether you have a legal document, only then you will be classed as scheduled tribe. In many social parlance, in the different kinds of interactions with which I engaged in the ground reality, we find that groups tend to fabricate, or at least they want to present the idea as a tribe. But it's the constitutional classification which becomes a problem, right? And this whole process of scheduling in Indian context, therefore, is a very big bureaucratic kind of a mechanism which has to be traversed. And that involves you engage with different kinds of people at different levels. Now, that is the ethnography which the book actually tries to develop. Right? So the nature of engagement at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, and so on and so forth. So how that manipulation, or at least that engagement takes place between various leaders, various stages of bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. So if you look at it, this whole idea of tribes, at least, is developed from the enumerative modality of colonial governance. Now, these things are already well known. There are many books which have already been published on the same kind of an idea, which reiterates the same point that the idea of a tribe is a colonial construct, right? But after it has been constructed, it also has developed a social life of its own. It perpetuates as a form of a crystallize. It's as a form of a fixity, right? So, but the categories are fixed, but to enter into those categories, the nature of politics have become very dynamic. That's the nature of societal and political changes which has taken place in the Indian context, and the issue of tribal recognition is not just alone in case of Darjeeling. Yeah, if you look at it more closely, it's a pan-India, pan-South Asia kind of a phenomenon. If you look at different regions, I'm currently located at IIT Mandi. So in Himachal also you have many demands which are made by ethnic groups to be recognized as tribes. So what one idea which was very prominent in many of the ways in which groups actually presented their claim is that the idea of tribe itself is slightly ambivalent, or it's polymorphous, right? It is not very much strictly related to only one kind of a cultural idiom. So what we find interestingly is that this whole idea of scheduled tribe demand actually shows the interactions between anthropology, colonial governance, and different kinds of classificatory categories which were devised both in the colonial as well as in the post-colonial time, and that has led to various kinds of interaction between the groups, the state, the local agencies, the regional leaders, and so on and so forth. That itself, that interaction and the space which has emerged has given a certain kind of credence to the idea of tribe. But officially, if you look at it from Lower Commission, these are the chief determining feature of a tribe. So I just wanted to put it in the slide so that you can at least understand the nature in which the state in some rudimentary form works with the idea of a tribe. So primitive trait, idiosyncratic or distinctive culture, geographical isolation, shyness of contact with other people, backwardness, and so on and so forth. Right? These are 5 major pointers which at least the local commission was discussing. But groups, when they engage with this idea, they all argue that we all have the same traits. Right? And it can also be argued by different other kinds of communities. It's not just only people of Darjeeling, but also from other places also they can claim the same thing. They would have certain kind of traits which can be considered as primitive, right? They can be certain kind of cultural tradition which can be considered as distinctive. Some groups may already live in geographically isolated places. So what I'm trying to emphasize on this point is that the whole idea of recognition as tribe has become very, very lucrative for certain groups of people and also for certain communities, because there is certain form of ambivalence. There's no hardcore concrete definition on the idea of tribe, and therefore there is also huge proliferation of demands for recognition as tribes in the Indian context. Well, we can discuss this further if you have any questions later. So the Darjeeling's case is very interesting because what you have is alongside the idea of scheduled tribe demand, it also is known for the regional demand, right? Since 1990s and even prior to that, since the colonial time, you also find that there is this regional demand for recognition as a distinct region. So starting from the 20th century, early part of 20th century, Darjeeling wanted to it should be carved out of the administrative provision of Bengal. So that was the demand, which ultimately crystallized into the Gorkha demand of 1980s and 1988. So that time you have this idea of Darjeeling as a separate statehood demand became more prominent during that period. So the whole idea of this regional demand actually revolves around a collective identity of a Gorkha. That's why you must have come across the Gorkhaland movement, Gorkha National Liberation Front, so and so forth, right? So what is interesting in case of my text is it tries to look at how people negotiate with their collective identity on one hand. The Gorkha identity is a collective form of an identity, right? It is a conglomerate of different kinds of ethnic groups, caste groups, different other kinds of communities also, in fact. Some of the people like Lepchas also would argue that they are part of the Gorkha, this imagination. So on one hand, you have this idea of a collective identity, but at the same time, you also see proliferation of ethnic demands, which are more exclusive and it's only very, very discrete in nature. That means you cannot be a tribe with a larger collectivity, right? You have to be more discrete in nature. So this idea of collective versus exclusive, discrete versus collective kind of an identity articulation is very much interesting in case of Darjeeling, which makes this whole issue of identity negotiation and identity claims and counterclaims a very, very contested kind of an arena of research. So what you find is that this regional demand and exclusive ethnic claims have actually conditioned a certain way of articulating the whole idea of identity in case of Darjeeling. So on one hand, you have the region, which is very important. In order to get the statehood, you also have to articulate your identity as a Gorkha. But when that whole movement failed, so I'm just trying to traverse this entire historical genealogy in a few lines. So when this movement actually started in 1986, at least the modern movement, and it went on for 2 years, and in 1988 it crystallized into a form of a council. It did not crystallize as a form of a statehood, full-fledged statehood. So it was like a Darjeeling Gorkha Hill Council which was constituted, but it had only a very limited kind of power. So at this point in time, so from 1980s, from 1990 onwards, it also actually coincides with this whole change in the this idea of preferential treatment to certain kinds of groups and minorities in case of Indian context, and we call it as the Mandal Commission, right? Mandal Commission was already constituted in late in 80s, but the report of the commission was made public only when VP Singh came to power. And from post-Mandal period, what you find is that people realize the fact that only through a collective articulation of this conglomerate Gorkha identity, we will not be able to secure what we actually want in our own lives. So the other avenue for them is to vouch for individual, discrete kind of identities. So firstly, some of those groups which I mentioned in my previous slides, they got the OBC status. So they got OBC status in the mid-90s. But over a period of time, they also realized the fact that, and there's a very interesting kind of a quotation which actually comes up from different ethnic leaders. They argue that OBC ka matlab na bhat hai na jaat hai. That means you don't even get your preferential rights in terms of reservation and so forth at par with SC and ST. Neither you can claim upper caste status. You are in the intermediary kind of space. So OBC means na to jat, na to bhat. That way they used to articulate. So from that period onward, what you see is that now groups slowly realize that in order to get more benefits from the state, it's also important for us to engage with other kinds of politics. And from that period onwards, you see the growth and development of this tribal route, or the demand for recognition as scheduled tribe. And the other important reason which has to be taken into consideration is that this idea of statehood, to a large extent, was also driven by this idea of asserting belongingness. As you look at the nature of population in Darjeeling, Kalimpong, the area, the field sites which I am conducting the research, where I have conducted the research, the people also have this stigmatized kind of an identity that they are a migrant community during the colonial time. Most of the people of Nepali origin, right? So they also have that kind of a stigmatized nation of identity as being migrant kind of a community who came from Nepal, and therefore they cannot be considered as an indigenous group who are residing in those regions. So one way in order to curb that kind of this feeling was to demand for a statehood. So people argue that if we have our own state, nobody would be able to call us as migrant. When that kind of politics failed, the other important avenue left was this scheduled tribe. Once you get the label of, or once you get this title of a scheduled tribe, nobody can call you an outsider, because by implications you mean that you are indigenous to that region, right? So that's also a shift that we can see in terms of when there's a failure of a certain kind of a movement, people also are shifting to a different kind of politics altogether. So, so most of the ethnic associations and different kinds of bodies which were formed when I was interacting with them, they all argued the fact that the association was started during mid-90s, and they started writing memorandums, talking to different regional leaders as well as state leaders and so on and so forth, and slowly forging their identity as a scheduled tribe. So this forms the background of the movement, or background of the study. And one of the title of the chapter, therefore, it also is a kind of a paradox. It's also a kind of a, you can yourself see, it's a title as moving forward to become backward. So the more you move ahead, right? And there are different kinds of channels, different kinds of bureaucratic as well as political channels through which you have to move ahead in order to become more backward. And by become backward, I mean that this whole issue is to claim certain kind of an identity which will lead for you to be recognized as a scheduled tribe. So this is one aspect which becomes the major bulk of the book, because here you can see different kinds of processes, different kinds of politics which groups are engaging in. And one important issue which became important during this period is also this sixth schedule kind of demands which were made. So as I told you that 1990s, or at least 1988, the whole Gorkhas movement failed. The other way in which they tried to revive this whole idea of regional demand was to claim that the entire region of Darjeeling should be put into the fold of the sixth schedule. And by implication, all the groups living in the region should be declared as a scheduled tribe. Now that kind of demand came from Shivas Singh, who was leading the Gorkhas movement. But this kind of movement probably did not have the same kind of resonance with the people. So in 2007, you will see that people actually discarded this whole idea of schedule because they did not understand actually. To be very honest, during the time when I was conducting the research, I used to often ask ethnic leaders that what was wrong with the sixth schedule demand which was made. So they thought that sixth schedule is more of a compromise, which the leader of Gorkha National Liberation Front was making in order to give up on the idea of Gorkha. So Gorkha was a full-fledged statehood, and that had actually crystallized in the mind of the people, and they therefore rejected this whole idea of sixth schedule. And from that onwards, in 2007 onwards, there was another series of agitation we started for Gorkhas and so on and so forth. But that also did not become successful. So periodically we see that, very interestingly, periodically we see the rise of a regional kind of an identity based on a collective sense of ethnicity of Gorkha. But when that does not reach its desired outcome, then there will be a series of multifarious kind of demands based on your own ethnic, exclusive ethnic identities. And that kind of fluctuation actually goes on, and we can also see that happening in today's time as well. So this makes the whole idea of ethnic issues very interesting to read, because it's not just one particular flow in which it actually traverses the entire historical spectrum. What you find is that there are ebbs and downs. There are certain kinds of flows. Sometimes certain kind of issues become prominent, sometimes that goes down, and in that vacuum, other kinds of identity concerns actually become more prominent. So the most important way in which groups are actually engaging in this whole process of demanding recognition as scheduled tribe can be considered, this term can be applied in the case also, is that autoethnography. Now this is also very interesting because of the fact that what happened during the course of this entire period was that as they realized the fact that we have to demand recognition as a scheduled tribe, that way we will also be securing our future, and we'll also be securing our sense of belongingness to the nation and so forth. So they also started engaging with other kinds of texts, different kinds of anthropologists and different leaders, they engage with them. And they realized the fact that for them to be recognized as a tribe, first and foremost, they have to produce certain kind of documents, right? Which proves the fact that they are an indigenous community residing in the hills of Darjeeling for a long period of time, right? So in order to prove that, what they started doing is that this is autoethnography, in which you yourself engage in certain kind of ethnographic research. Because they are all OBC groups, most of them are OBC, few of them are upper caste gender group. So there is no data on how many people live in Darjeeling of that particular caste background. Because there is no caste census, right, in Indian context. So they themselves started visiting different kind of villages, conducting census kind of operations in order to produce certain kind of ethnographic document, which they would submit alongside with their memorandum. And other interesting thing was that because they also have to show their identity as authentic, what they did was that because in Darjeeling most of the groups are migrated, right? Like it's true, it's historically a factual kind of a statement. So many of the ethnic associations also started going to the Nepal side in order to know more about their authentic cultural practices. But those kind of details would not be shared before the others. If you ask them directly whether you go to Nepal in order to draw some kind of ethnographic material on Nepal, they will simply deny it, right? But I am an insider, I had an advantage to understand that kind of politics, so at least I have those kind of insights in which they are trying to say that we do. Sometimes it's more like a field visit, as scholars of social sciences, we also engage in field work and all. In the same sense, the paradigm of academic knowledge production is also internalized by ethnic groups themselves. So anthropology is not anthropology in the sense of what we do in the academic parlance. Anthropology also becomes embedded within the rich and a very, very complex process of ethnic formation in the very first instance, right? So I hope you get this idea. So the idea of tribe, which actually comes up from that kind of interaction, becomes very, very interesting, and it's not a rigid kind of identity, it's always manipulable. Sometimes you also fabricate certain kind of things in order to fit in with the idea of tribe which the state actually projects before the people. So I'll come to this point, but this too becomes most important in autoethnography. The idea of alterity, that is difference, you also have to be different from the other, right? You have to mark yourself, your cultural identity as distinct from the other. So alterity, difference becomes important. At the same time, authenticity becomes the most important fact of demanding recognition as a tribe. So because of all these things, what we see is that from a transformation from the citizens, what we see is that they also transform themselves as subjects of anthropological gaze, subjects of certain form of inquiry, right? They themselves are turning their own group, their own community as certain form of a subject through which they have to refabricate the identity as a tribe. So in this entire quest, you find that certain kinds of villages would be turned into an ethnic conclave. If you have a village where 10 people or 20 families of a Mongol group stays, those village would be considered, though it will be converted as a model village. So you have a formation of those kind of ethnic enclaves and model villages also. And this process I'm calling in this book as instrumental requirement for institutional essentialism. That means what people do, the ethnic communities are engaged in, is this instrumental process of collecting things which only align itself with the state-defined categories of tribe. Other kinds of attributes are not important, right? Only those things which can indicate to the fact that you are a primitive group, you are backward, you are isolated, you have shyness of contact with other group. You selectively use those kind of idioms from their own cultural repertoire in order to showcase your identity as a tribe. So it's more of an instrumental, it's a requirement by the state, right? Because when you are submitting the document and so on and so forth, you also have to fulfill all those kind of criteria. Otherwise, it will be summarily rejected at different kinds of bureaucratic channels. So it's more of an instrumental requirement for institutional essentialism. What institutional essentialism means that by conditioning this way of understanding of a tribal population or as a scheduled tribe in Indian context, that is also is a certain form of a essentialism. I assume that all of us are familiar with this idea of essentialism. That means you are also essentializing the characteristic of a group through certain kind of at least characteristics. And so the two pictures that you can see, this is part of the book itself, but I just wanted to explain. So in different kinds of festivals, different kinds of ethnic events in which they are actually trying to showcase their identity as a scheduled tribe. So the whole idea of tribal identity assertion is more of a performative claim. That means you have to have an attire which depicts you to be tribal in characteristics. You have to have certain form of authentic, so-called authentic, is also fabricated otherwise. If you look at it, there's nothing called authentic as such. The whole idea of culture itself there's no authenticity in it, right? It always undergoes certain kind of transformation. And this is even more interesting. Now, these two are actually what this group is, a group known as Bujel. So Bujel, they are one minority, like not minority as such, but in terms of numerical strength, they are a small community in Darjeeling. So this is a death ritual actually they are trying to conduct. And the booklet from where they are reading actually has come from Nepal. So the ethnic associations of Nepal have come up. There's a bigger community of Bujel in Nepal. So they have come up with their own rules and certain kind of normative behavior that you have to follow in terms of certain kinds of life-related rituals, right? So they are, so earlier they never did it in that kind of format. So they used to do it in different other, which is part of the Brahmanical Hinduism, that Hinduized kind of tradition. When I was conducting the fieldwork, very difficult it was for them to read through those kind of texts, right? But still, they were trying to, at least to showcase their identity as authentic. They are also trying to read through those kind of texts and to showcase the fact that they are an authentic group who deserve recognition as scheduled tribe. Now, this is not very clear, but still, this is the entire bureaucratic channel through which the process of scheduling tribe actually goes through. So if you can look at it, you have a different kind of stages, different kinds of, so for first is filing application for scheduled tribe. Then from here you can see like in the bureaucratic form, it goes in that particular fashion. So from there, verification of historical and cultural details, it goes to backward classes welfare department of West Bengal. Then they conduct one study from the CRI, it's called Central Research Institute. So it goes in that particular fashion. But the groups also engage in other kinds of activities like forging certain connections with local political leaders, frequent interaction between CRI official and aspiring groups. Then you have political parties pressurizing the state government to consider the application. So if it goes through all those kind of channels, it moves to different kind of relevance. So from there, if the CRI and other kind of body approves, then the CM recommends the group to be recognized as scheduled tribe. Then it goes to the Registrar General of India. Registrar General of India conducts another level of study, which is known as the Anthropological Survey of India conducts. Anthropological Survey of India conducts another case, another ethnographic study. And then there is a huge bureaucratic channel which goes in structuring of this claims. So on this panel you can see that there are various, there are numbers of claims which are accepted by the state government or rejected by the Registrar General of India. There are many claims on the contrary that Registrar General of India has recommended those groups to be recognized as tribe, but other groups, but the state government has not yet accepted that those groups to be recognized as tribe. So as I was telling you in the previous slide, moving forward to become backward. Now this is a kind of a oxymoron in a sense, but that's the truth in Indian context in today's time. So for all this kind of bureaucratic procedures to be fulfilled, the group requires certain kind of resource. So only group who are already mobile can fulfill all those kind of requirement in some way or the other. So that's also a kind of a paradox that you can see. You need to have certain kind of bureaucratic, you need to know people, you also need to have good channels or interactions with the local level politicians and so forth. Only then your chances of being at least heard by the Registrar General of India or Anthropological Survey of India would be, at least there would be a chance for you to be, at least a study to be conducted by this kind of central bodies. Otherwise the chances seems to be very bleak at the best when it comes to recognition as a tribe. So not taking much time, so at least the major tropes through which the groups try to structure their identities as tribes in case of Darjeeling is that first ancient and pre-Aryan group who worship the nature and so forth. So this kind of a conception, I'm also trying to outline this fact that why they are claiming all this kind of things is because of the application from their side went to the state government. State government actually instituted one inquiry from the Central Research Institute, which actually deals with different kinds of demands which were made by the group. So those state anthropologists, they visited Darjeeling, and according to many of the ethnic leaders, what they did was that they were trying to verify certain kind of things, right? Whether your woman wears vermilion after getting married or not. Whether if it's yes, then your chances would go a little down. So that's all how the ethnic leaders actually interpreted it. So in response to those kind of surveys which were conducted by the state anthropologists, they structured certain kind of narrative around which, if not a narrative, certain kind of tropes through which they try to structure their demands as a scheduled tribe. One is pre-Aryan group who worship nature and so on and so forth. So other thing is they have distinct social practices in comparison with the caste Hindus, and this is vociferously actually claimed by many of the ethnic associations, stating that they are a non-caste group. Because the moment you say that and you have presence of caste-like features within your community, then it will be interpreted by other anthropologists as having you are a caste-like group, therefore you don't deserve to be recognized as a tribe, right? So most of the leaders, they vehemently argue that they are a non-caste group, and rather their social organization is based on certain kinds of clan groupings. Now this making of clan, this technology of production of clan itself is a very, very difficult kind of terrain for which you need different kinds of documents, different kinds of ethnographic and also historical details that you will need in order to structure a clan kind of based organization of a society. So they argue that they have their own clan kind of social structure, and therefore they are distinct from the caste Hindus. And the last trope is this idea of indigeneity. That means we have been living in the Himalayan region. Now it's not about Darjeeling, it's not about Sikkim, it's not about the entire, what they are claiming by implication is that the groups who are residing in Darjeeling actually have been residing in the entire Himalayan region, right? Starting from Kashmir all the way till Arunachal and so on and so forth. So there are by implication there's all this national boundaries between Nepal and India and other kinds of things have come up only in the recent historical past. But the groups who have been residing in the entire Himalayan region is so by implication that they are indigenous to the place. So this idea that we came with the land to the Indian nation state rather than coming as without any kind of land. So that kind of narrative also structured the major frames and the tropes through which groups try to structure their claims as scheduled tribe. So last thing I just wanted to share, that is a very interesting kind of ethnographic insights that I came across, is this idea of seeing the state, and also this idea of concealing from the state. So this whole notion of what should be performed before the state in order to showcase your identity as a tribe. But there are also other kinds of practices which you don't want to showcase before the state. So luckily for me at least, I was able to attend some of the so-called secret meetings of ethnic associations. That means they don't want to, because most of the things, what happens is that it's all publicized. Because the more publicity that you get, the more you perform your identity before a larger audience, the more it will crystallize the idea of tribe, right? At least people will have a sense of this community also has primitive culture and so on and so forth. But this idea of concealed identity is also very interesting, because now in those kind of secret meetings, they will actually talk about how we can actually draw from other groups also some idioms, so that we can, at least in our ethnographic reports, we can write about our traditional past and about our heritage and so on and so forth. So on one hand, they are also trying to show before the state certain nature of their own identity. At the same time, when they are structuring their claims, they are also hiding certain kinds of identity claims before being visible before the state. So most important parts in the concluding remarks, I would just like to highlight. If you can see, I think this is one of the calendars. Now there are various ways in which groups also try to textualize tradition, right? Because they argue that most of our accounts were actually only oral in nature. So in many ethnic associations, they were also trying to write down their own grammar. They were trying to write down their own lexicon. They are trying to revive so-called their own scripts and so on and so forth. Because that also becomes a part and parcel of this whole this atmosphere of tribal recognition. So if you can see on this side, this is a calendar which was actually prepared by All India Gurung Tamil Buddhist Association. And the year, if you can see, is 2005-77. So they are reckoning different kind of time frame, they are reckoning different ways in which they are structuring certain kind of idea of that community as being very, very old and primitive, right? So how they come up with those kind of ideas, that itself is a very important, crucial question, but nevertheless, we can at least look at this 4 or 5 major ways in which this idea of scheduled tribe actually gets structured. So modes of textualization, by writing about different things, by writing the grammar, the writing about different cultural practices, groups are trying to preserve, or at least they wanted to showcase before the state that we also have certain kinds of authentic rituals before us. So they are using rituals as a strategy, and also in the process it becomes strategic ritualism. That means the rituals are no longer only done only for the ritual sanctity of the same. You also do it in order to, this becomes a part of a performance, a performative claim. In fact, when I went to one of the villages, they argued that now it's time for us to actually conduct the ritual. You came in a very good time. It's already approaching winters and now, so you can join us for the ritual tomorrow. That will also show you at least how authentic and how primitive traits are already in our cultural group. So rituals are also strategized, and they are used as a way in which it becomes a vehicle, it becomes a sign for people to at least understand the idea of, I will not go into this idea of representment, this is a little complex. So in a nutshell, we can argue that the whole idea of ethnicity in case of Darjeeling, rather than being one kind of a monolith kind of a structure, it's more situational in nature, right? And therefore, I am also developing this idea of calling ethnicity as an event. That means what kind of ethnic idea becomes prominent, because the last part of the book also has a lot of survey, and in which I'm asking different people how do they identify with different kinds of categories. So what we find is that it depends upon the kind of event. If the event is more of a Gorkha movement, more of a regional demand, all of them would identify themselves as Gorkha irrespective of their distinctive claims which they are making on the ground reality. But when there is movement for scheduled tribe status, so and so forth, the idea of Gorkha slightly takes a backseat, and you have the exclusive ethnic claims becoming more and more prominent. So ethnicity, rather than being only one kind of a flow of event, it's rather the event which actually shapes the idea of ethnicity, right? The different kind of situation. That's why I'm calling it as situational ethnicity and contingent identities. That means there are different kind of situation which emerges, and the identities become contingent on those events and situations. So this would be so lastly, I will just conclude by this idea that what I find in case of South Asia, but it's not just limited to my understanding of Darjeeling, there are also this kind of an ambiguity when we are looking at this idea of categorization, because what happens is that in case where certain kind of groups are recognized without verifying, as I'm telling you the paradox of recognition unfolding in Indian context, there are groups who are very, very mobile, they already have certain kind of cultural background, they also have resources to be mobilized, so that those groups have a better chance to be recognized as backward, in fact. Right? So in many situations it has happened. So what it has led to is I'm calling as categorization violence, and what in many regards groups are demanding in today's time is classificatory justice. It's not just to gain entry into preferential treatment. It's because people tend to think that it's only to be to get the benefit of reservation. People want this kind of recognition and scheduled tribe and so on and so forth. At least we also have to problematize this little more in order to understand the fact that there are certain groups and community for whom it's not just only about the preferential treatment as such. That is very much there, right? For educational purpose, for education, for economic as well as for employment and all. That is very much there. But at the same time, there is also this quest for them to find out their own identities, to be very, very frank and very, very lucid. So what you see is that it's time for us also to look at the nature in which the categories in Indian context have crystallized, and the process of categorization which takes place, as I'm outlining in the, as I was discussing in the text and in the presentation also, that the nature in which the idea of the category itself becomes slightly not well defined, it becomes ambiguous. At the same time, because the people who are working in the field, who are actually doing the whole process of data collection and so on and so forth, state anthropologists, or if you have to call them, so they are also in that kind of an ambiguous kind of a mixture. So identifying, because the state government actually comes up, the constitutions clearly states that your affiliation to any kind of religious belief is not a necessary condition for you to be recognized as a tribe. To be recognized as a caste, scheduled caste, religion still plays a very important role. But when it comes to tribe, it can be a Hindu, it can be Muslim, it can be anybody, a Christian. That's why we have all those groups recognized as tribe in context, right? But the way in which the survey and other things will be done, it already shows the fact that there are certain kind of biases. So if you find that the groups worship the Hindu deities or has Hindu festivals and so on and so forth, they would be not considered as par with other groups. So this actually leads to certain form of violence, I would argue. And therefore, for us as a social scientist is also to engage with this whole process of category formation and the idea of categorization more strictly. It's not just limited to the idea of tribes, but we can do the same for other forms of categories through which we work as social scientists. Thank you, and this stop.
Yes. We will now open the floor to questions. And there is tea outside, by the way. Just wanted to inform everybody that there is tea and coffee outside. So please ask questions. We do not have any questions or comments on the live thing. I've been keeping an eye on this. So if you would.
One by one.
Thanks, Dr. Chhetri, for the talk. One of the problems with the sociological studies on minorities, whether it be ethnic minorities or religious minorities, has been that often it is kind of reduced to a cultural question, with very little focus on the question of class.
Okay.
That the identity gets to be treated as a bundle of cultural rights, etc. Whether it be from Muslim code or anything of that sort. That's why Maidul Islam or people like that, like them would argue that the question of Muslim community, for instance, Muslim question needs to be posed as a class question, especially with Sacha committee and other things coming.
Okay.
So in that context, and parallelly, the state would always want, rather, the history shows that there's a culturalizing project that's going on, whether it be the case of caste or ethnicity. There's an attempt of culturalizing caste, which aids the larger project of the modern nation state when it comes to minority question. Right. So one of the ways in which sociology, at least, has in the earlier times, perhaps before 1990s at least, tried to attempt is to go beyond this cultural logic by bringing in the questions of political economy, for instance, and how it impacts the question of identity. However, with 2000s particularly, when this holy trinity of culture studies came into being and identity became one of that.
Dr. Rajan and all, right?
Yeah. So then the question of identity again got reduced to the question of culture, which very well aids the project of the modern nation state. So in your project, also I see a very conspicuous absence of the question of class. And that economic reconfiguration in discussing the question of identity. And there I see it as a larger problem with the methodological orientation in understanding identity, at least from the discipline of sociology. So how do you respond to that is my first question. And the second one is, so has it got to do with some kind of a proclivity to this methodological nationalism, that the question of nation state is almost taken for granted, even when it comes to something like Gorkha. The question of, I don't see any sort of signaling of a methodological attempt to go beyond the territorial or the imaginative and the mental orientation, mental scape of the nation state in your study. So how do you respond to that?
Thank you very much for this. It's a very interesting question. The second question I will answer first, because that's true. Like there are certain kind of shortcomings in terms of the methodological, because it operates with some form of methodological nationalism. But that also has to do with the nature of politics, which is unfolding in case of Darjeeling, I would say. Because the groups themselves would, and it was also like when I started this entire project, it was also something which is morally binding on the researcher also at times, right? Because I being an insider, they would also make certain kinds of claim that you provide authentic understanding of the groups residing in the Himalayan region, at least because in some of the interviews which I conducted with the ethnic leaders, they are also argued that the reports which are prepared by the Bengalis who are coming from Calcutta, CRI and others, they are already biased actually in their reportage, and therefore this entire quest becomes sidelined actually. So on one hand, this idea of I could have done the similar kind of exercise also in Nepal, right? Because the nature of ethnic current has similar kind of resonance also in Nepal, or for the matter Sikkim as well. But I thought that what I can do is that the nature of group that I'm trying to study is also huge. So I'll just try to stick around in the Darjeeling region and see how influence from outside actually come and shape their concern, rather than me myself going to different kinds of multi-sited ethnographic kind of a project. I would rather look at how different kinds of currents from different places also come in, pour in the nature of. So you can look at Facebook, those kind of digital, those kind of media also, social media, in which those kind of current, those kind of demands also find resonance in that sense. So I try to do, that was very limited, but at least I try to look at how other kinds of influence from outside the region also shape to a large extent. And looking at this nature of Darjeeling as a space becomes very, very interesting because of its epicenter of Nepali Gorkha politics. So everything actually, irrespective of wherever you are located, from Dehradun, from Assam, from other places, things actually tend to converge over there. It becomes the formative ground for different kinds of ideas to be forged. So in that sense, yeah, there are some limitations, but then that's the issue of class. Now that's very, very important. What I was trying to do is not just only look at the cultural side of those demands and all, but also look at how group actually forge certain kind of identities of their own through different kinds of performative claims. I also conducted, so in the book, if you read the last part of the chapters and other chapters, have the survey data in which I am also trying to note down people of belonging to which kind of category in terms of their economic category, what kind of responses do they have vis-a-vis the idea of identity, vis-a-vis the idea of culture, and so on and so forth. So, but that is still not a very structural kind of interpretation. But my concern was slightly different in the sense like I was trying to understand more of this processes of classification rather than understanding only the groups in its truest form. So some anthropologists who studied these groups in Darjeeling also tend to argue that there's a Nakali identity and a Sakali identity. So I just wanted to actually bypass those kind of binaries, which is an authentic identity, which is not an authentic identity. Identity by implication is also like that only, in fact. There's nothing authentic about anything, right? So we actually make certain kind of claim by saying that those kind of identity claims are authentic and inauthentic and so on and so forth. But when you look at the way in which the lived realities of the people, you find that this whole idea of category itself is negotiated at different kind of. In social parlance, people have different kinds of categories through which they work, in fact. But when it comes to the bureaucratic categories of the state-defined categories, the nature of politics also tends to change slightly. So that was the major, at least task which I was trying to undertake.
It's just a follow-up, just clarify, and my point was not that the structural analysis is lacking. My point was that even not about the value between structural and discursive, but even when you undertake such a project within your framework, in which you talk about the question of identity, even within that framework, the question of class could be brought in. For instance, in the studies on middle class, for instance, there have been people who study middle class through the entry point of large holdings placed on the large urban cities.
Okay.
Right.
So to answer that,
Like that.
you asked everything. So when you look at the ethnic associations as such, so there would be those kind of issues, right? Who are the members, who are the leaders, in fact? They always come from a certain kind of a class background, educational background, and so on and so forth, right? So in what I'm calling them as ethnic entrepreneurs, so they come from a certain kind of a background, which is with the educational background, cultural background. They have also seen the world around, and so on and so forth. So you already see that they are structuring their identity along their own perceived position within the larger ethnic groups, vis-a-vis the idea of tribe which is demanded by the Indian state, the requirements which are there. So that interaction is definitely taking place. So on one hand you have ethnic entrepreneurs, and I'm also making a classification on another kind of group who are known as, which I'm calling them as identity framers. So you also require people of the lowermost segment within that community, but who knows the rituals well, because you have to strategize the rituals as well in order to showcase your identity. It will not only work from the top-down approach, right? So there is a very nice kind of a balance which ethnic association themselves forge between people coming from a certain kind of class background and also those who come from the lowermost rung of that community.
Thank you so much, sir. So in the context of statehood or identity politics, ethnopolitics of Darjeeling, California, so where do you situate the lectures? So considering they also share the same territory, they also reside in the same territory, and also how associated or disassociated are the lectures from this larger political demand of the state?
Okay. It's a very interesting question, very interesting, and at the same time very contested at times. Because you see, what happened in case of Darjeeling is that there's three groups, right? Lepchas are considered to be the most indigenous in terms of historical records and all. Then you have the Bhutias who came with different forms of migration. You have the state formation in Sikkim and so on and so forth. And the third entrant would be the Nepalis who came. So since the early 20th century, there has been different kind of organizations who are working in order to bring these three groups together as a cohesive kind of unit. So some organizations and also political parties called all these groups as hill people, hillmen's associations were forged during the early part of 20th century. And they are in fact slogans which were actually raised during 1930s and 40s that Lepcha Nepali, Lepcha Bhutia Nepali, Hami Sabai Gorkhali. That means this idea of Gorkhali is to forge a very strong connection between these three communities. But as these things change over a period of time, especially from 1960s, 86 and 88. What we also find is that there's a fracture in this whole idea of Gorkha identity to some extent. And and the major point actually it came about also in 2014-15, wherein lecture youths who wanted to join army. Now this is also very interesting that the youths from Darjeeling get one certificate known as the Gorkha certificate, which will help you in paramilitary and other forms of recruitment. So the lecturers were not given this certificate, and once the youths were denied, back home they started demanding that the Gorkhaland will not get any kind of substantial benefit. So they rather demanded for a development board. So that politics I did not actually develop, show you, discuss in the presentation today. But now there has also been different groups who are already recognized as scheduled tribe. Now they have actually initiated another kind of politics, that is the politics to demand development councils. This is not constitutional, it's neither, does not have a very legal standing. But at the same time, the state government is very happy because they feel that by dividing these groups in terms of different kinds of development council, the whole Gorkha identity would fracture. So it's a win-win case for the state as well, right? So if you locate lectures within that kind of spectrum, you find that there is a genuine sense of apathy amongst them, in the sense that the whole idea of the collective Gorkha identity would not resonate with them, because they are also trying to restructure and also, if not restructure, but to reclaim back what was their lost culture and civilization, right? So in that sense, there is still an amicable relation amongst the group. It's not very hostile, as in the case of Manipur and other places. And that is also because of the shared genealogy for a considerable period of time. I think that's also to be at least highlighted.
Thank you, sir.
So firstly, it's a huge inspiration for me, since you said you're from Kalimpong, and even I
Okay.
myself am from Kalimpong. So to see somebody, belonging from such a small hometown area to be on the dais is a very rare occasion for me. So this was extremely inspiring. And also the fact, me myself, I belong to a Nepali speaking community, and yet despite of that I'm still an ST, I'm still Tamil. And for me, the whole presentation was a whole personal journey being reflected. So the fact that you spoke about identity crisis, I myself I faced on many levels. Like when I moved to Calcutta for higher education, I could, even with the general questions of asking you, since I belong to a Nepali speaking community, so are you from Nepal? So all these kind of adjectives are always there. And also later on, when I started working and doing many field studies, I could see in areas such as in Odisha, the concept of tribe is very different there, including the particularly vulnerable tribal groups who reside there. So there also, I was for me it was also a different reflection that tribes do not only belong to a certain area and a certain region also. So in your presentation, sir, I could see that there was a lot of argument between the top-down and the bottom-up approach, where the experts at the top level actually trying to give a definition of how to, how people, how tribe is supposed to be there, and also how the people at the grassroots level were trying to cope with it or trying to fit with it, maybe because of certain benefits or statehood demand that they were getting. So also you being an insider there, so how is it possible for you to be just non-biased and not have this preconceived notion, and to detach from that whole situation and just to see as a scholar?
Well, complete detachment is not possible sometimes, I feel. So when I really asked about this question of methodological nationalism also, in the same sense I wanted to keep it within the Indian state only, so that there would not be any kind of charge that this kind of data was forged by taking certain kind of ethnographic help in the region of Nepal. That becomes a problem for, as you as an insider would know about this, right? So there are a lot of challenges. That's why I also indicated this living strangely with intimates. That means you also have to assume your own self and own identity as a stranger when you know too much, when you are too familiar. That's sometimes advantages but also disadvantages, because in many other instances the ethnic groups would not answer to my question. And simply I would say that you already know, why should we answer? Why we are doing it, or how we are doing it, whether it was done by our forefathers or not. You know, because many of the things were probably not done during their forefathers' time, which they have tried to accumulate over a period of time from different places. So it becomes very, very difficult at times. This ethical conundrum of an insider is very important. And also your identity as a male also becomes important, right? Because many of the instances what you have, what you can see in case of ethnic movements like this is that women perform the, what I'm calling in one of my paper as Goffmanian labor of impression management. Men, they will only wear a small turban, that's the representation of the authentic identity. But women's body becomes the embodiment of that authentic identity of a tribe, right? So those spaces would be still difficult for a man to at least interrogate too deeply into their attire, how, so and so forth. So those are the practical challenges that you at least have in the field. And also this politics, as you already know, of the hills is very much, so different negotiations which are carried out between this local level, then Kalimpong, then Darjeeling, then it goes to different so to talk to different political leaders, things becomes very challenging. So as I mentioned about the secret meeting, so there was also representation from Vimal Guru was the head leading the political movement. So he has different kinds of metaphorical way of explaining to us how it goes. So one way in which he explained was that Vimal Guru has promised that he will play a better trick than Mamata Banerjee. So that this whole idea of playing with certain things in order to get your demand fulfilled and ratified from the center is also interesting. So there are challenges as well as there are opportunities which are offered to an insight. Language becomes easier, so and so forth. You know the, but in some regards, like the festival that I was showing on the board is called as Sakeva, Sakela, I think, from the Kirati Congo, right? So we were not familiar with this while growing up as a child, right? So it becomes also something which is very completely anew for me also as an insider. So you also have to approach them with an air of, what can we say, unfamiliarity at times.
Yes.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, how far along do you see this project of reframing the ethnic identity going? Because your field was, far as I could gather, it was restricted to Darjeeling and a few areas near Darjeeling. So, but would you say that your work field was representative of all of, let's say, the Gorkhaland area?
No, it's not.
Okay, so that actually brings me to the second point in that. So let's say, as a counterfactual, the Anthropological Survey of India actually does embark on an anthropological survey. Do you expect them to find significant contentions within the community about these developments? Because it's one thing for a group of people who are embarking on this project of ethnic reframing, and the reason why they're able to do it successfully to a certain extent is because they have a shared, let's say, political or organizational past, right? It's people belonging to the same organizational networks that carry out this reframing. What about people who exist beyond those networks? And the class dimension, I was about to ask it, but that's already been partially answered to you. So there is that class dimension, of course, but there is also that organizational dimension, as in people who are insiders to the organizational setup and people who are outsiders. Added to that is the question of, let's say, a level of belief in one's own, for lack of a better word, lie. Some people are in on the joke, as in they are privy to the secret meetings. Other people have to believe. Get high on their own supply, so to speak. Again, for lack of a better frame of speech. So, how successful do you think that can get, or how far successful have you seen that come?
Okay. So when it comes to this idea of success of ethnic associations in forging certain kind of cultural idioms, to some extent they have become successful, because some groups of some people whom I knew who died like after the field work, and I knew all these people. So otherwise they would have done the modern rituals and others through a certain kind of Hindu practices. Now they have started doing it from 1517 onwards in a very different kind of way. So they have their own religious experts, their own, not experts, at least specialists and all, and they have their own elaborate ways which they have actually tried to learn over a period of time, learn and also draw from other communities in Nepal and other places. So that seeping in of that refabricated nature of cultural identity is already taking place. That's also what you asked this question. It's very, very true and very significant. I did not develop it in the presentation. Is this because there is too much emphasis on this idea of authenticity, right? So what constitutes an authentic Rai? Who is an authentic mother, or who is an authentic? She comes from the Tamil community, so she would know. So on the very idea of this, who is an authentic, ethnic associations have actually formed the splinter organizations, right? So the Gurungs, as I showed you, now one segment of the Gurungs argue that if we showcase ourselves as Buddhist, we would also get a benefit as a minority, religious minority. At the same time, we will also get, it'll better our chances to be recognized as a tribe, because in their understanding, Buddhist group in Indian context, most of them have already been recognized as a tribe. So one segment of that actually feels that. But the group has also adopted the Hindu practices and traditions and so on and so forth. The other segment says that staying true with that tradition, or at least, in fact, if we want to go back, we have to go back to our animistic faith, rather than Buddhism as a form of religion. So on the basis of this whole idea of cultural authenticity, groups have been bifurcated into, associations have been bifurcated in terms of their affiliations to either one who is articulating a certain kind of identity frame, and the others would be articulating in a very different kind of a frame. So your question actually is very good.
And politically, how far along do you think we have come?
Politically, not that much in the sense, because I don't see it transforming itself into a kind of political kind of manifestation, because when you look at this ethnic demands, it's more framed along the idea of the collective identity of the Gorkhas. So it's more situational. Sometimes it is, so in 2017, that's very interesting, the book actually concludes with that kind of observation. That means in the period of 2007 and 2014-15, people were apprehensive of the fact that all this tribalism and all would lead to the decline of the Gorkha identity. But just the contrary happened. So in 2017, when there was already another resurgence of the Gorkha movement, in which people actually came up together as a form of a collectivity. So that's why I'm trying to argue that it's the events and different kinds of situations which can trigger certain form of ethnic affiliations to the categories that you actually have. Gorkha also is not just one identity, it's a category, in fact, I would say.
And have these, the reframing of this identity, has it caught on beyond the Darjeeling area, beyond the Darjeeling area?
No, in Assam side, I don't know how much they have done. I have not done any kind of inquiry here, because Gorkhas also want scheduled tribe. They also have that demand in Assam as well. Right? In Uttarakhand also, they are doing it. In Himachal also, I am aware of, but as I am trying to emphasize on this point, that the raising a movement also requires resources and capital, and Darjeeling has all this capital in optimum level because of this history of raising different kinds of mobilizations since the turn of the 20th century. There's already a viable form of capital, and that gets channelized into different kinds of mobilizations.
We will just take one more question, Abhilasha's, and maybe we can continue. Yeah. This has been an extremely successful interaction. Abhilasha's question, and then we will maybe we can continue the conversation outside with tea. So Abhilasha.
Just wanted to know, sir, how does the relationship between the people, the hills, forests, and the relation of production between these entities, the hills and the forests, play out during the claim making?
Forests.
Hills,
okay.
yeah. When you mentioned that.
Okay. Forest, not in the economic kind of an idea, I have not explored that much. But when it comes to this idea of enclaves that I was talking about, right? So this notion that a tribal group would have certain kind of sacred groves, and within that sacred group there would be villages and so on and so forth. That has actually crystallized amongst many communities. So I myself visited, and what they do is that they create that kind of enclave, so that when state anthropologists they come and visit, they can take them to those kind of spaces. Rather than take them to the urban spaces, they will be taken to those kind of remote villages, in those kind of ethnic enclaves, where they have created model villages and all. So that they can get a first-hand insight as to how that particular community actually lived once upon a time, right? So in that sense, forests play a very important role in structuring certain kind of narrative about their own primitive past. In a way. But economically, I have not actually. So if you ask me about the correlation between forest produce and that, I don't have understanding. But symbolically, definitely. So lastly, I'll just conclude one more thing that this whole idea of classification has been so contested, and so not in case of Darjeeling, in case of Darjeeling also it's contested. Now in case of Himachal, at least where I am located, they have already, the state government has already recognized one category known as scheduled tribe, Dalit. A caste group within a scheduled tribe who has dual kind of benefit as a scheduled tribe as well as a Dalit within that segment of population. So you can look at the complexities involved in this whole process of categorization and classification in Indian context. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chhetri. Please join us for tea.